Hi, welcome everyone to today's webinar organized by the EGBA on monitoring customer behavior, harnessing data and technology to support safer online gambling. So as you know, this webinar is part of the European Safer Gambling Week. And if you viewed yesterday, there was a more theoretical discussion about what is needed to better understand problem gambling. Now, one of the key recommendations by the academics yesterday was to use more account-based data, which is a very good way of actually analyzing and measuring problematic play. And I think this is a good segue for today's webinar, where we look more into the practical and operational side of things on how operators can promote safer gambling and the use of data. So if we go to the next slide. So the agenda for today, as you know, I'm introducing this webinar and I'll be the moderator today. My name is Maris Catania. I'm the head of RG and research in Kindred Group. And I'm sorry to say you have to listen to me for a bit more time because I'm going to do a presentation on some of the studies that we've done. Then followed by, you'll have a break from my voice and we'll have a great panel discussion with quite a few great people on board. We have Gronia from Entain, joining us, Rasmus from Mindway AI, Dan Spencer from Epic, and Dan Whitlam from Gamcare. So obviously making it very easy for me to have two Dans to moderate the panel. Just some logistics before we start. So we really encourage you to ask any questions. We're going to have a chat box available for you to ask any questions that you want. And I'll try to post this during the panel discussion. If we don't manage to cover all the questions, we'll try our best to send answers afterwards through the EGBA. And there will be also a video recording of this webinar, which will be available afterwards. So we can start, I guess, with the presentation. So as I mentioned, I work at Kindred. And what I'm presenting today is mainly how we monitor customer behavior, but also to show how we can harness data and how we can use technology to actually support safer online gambling. A big part of my job is doing research, so I'll focus more on that aspect and try to show how research can actually bridge into operational reality. So we have three focus areas, and this is really important to mention. A lot of operators I see that tend to work in silo, that they try to do everything themselves. And even if you see the panel speakers today, you have different, like you have from Gamcare, from Epic, and from Mindway. These are really good stakeholders that you should have as an online operator, because I think the basis of everything should be at the academia. And I'm biased because I'm a nerd, but I still think it's very good. Then you have the community focus, where you can work with companies like Epic, for example, or Gamban, where you can have different expertise through lived experience or through technology on how to help the operator minimize harm. And obviously, everything would fall down into the customer focus. Now, if we look into the gambling spectrum, we see, and it was also mentioned yesterday, and Margaret did the presentation on it, it's quite difficult to pinpoint and to even understand what is problem gambling. And according to the latest EGBA study, we see that prevalence studies actually go from 0.3% to 6.4%. And I do sometimes hear operators say, you know, it's a small percentage and maybe we should focus more on the general population. But what we really need to keep in mind is that for each person that experiences any type of gambling harm, we see that at least 22 people are impacted. So the number is quite huge. If we consider, for example, if I had to experience gambling harm, my team, which is made around 30 people, will all be impacted. And that's not considering my family, my relatives as well. And it's very important for operators to use this type of information to be more proactive and customer-centric. Next slide. And this is quite typical what we see from operators, so how they work when it comes to minimizing harm. There's systems that are detecting the markers of harm. They're seeing if someone is showing some signs. Then there's an assessment. It's either done by analysts or sometimes by systems, where the markers of harm are then explored through different behavioral patterns, detected customer patterns, and the categorization. Most of the time, you hear a lot of operators saying there's the low, medium, or high risk. And what do we do? And it's very important then to mitigate. So it's not enough. There's a lot of focus on the detection, but how do we mitigate harm? How do we can actually interact with the customer to make them go back, to having gambling as a form of entertainment, or in cases where they need to stop. Next slide. And the next one. So what we see, and this was more a trajectory that I saw along the years, was that initially a lot of systems were based on financial activity, which is understandable. Even when you see if the regulator fines companies, it's always based on the financial activity. A customer overspent, a customer went beyond his means. And even we see that a lot of financial fines are placed on the operators. But there's also been a transition in research. Whereas before, most of the research conducted in gambling was done in lab studies where students were given, for example, the chance to gamble. Obviously, it's not always the best approach because this is not real life data. At the same time, you have a lot of self reports. So you ask people, okay, how much did you gamble or how did you do? And we know that then there's the social desirability effect there, which is a major bias, where people will only tell you what you want to hear. So when the online gambling industry came, what researchers also realized, and some of them are still a bit skeptic though, is that we can see objectively the data. We have the best type of data now where we can analyze exactly how people are gambling. But how can we do this? So if you go on the next slide, we see that most of the time, as I mentioned, we focus on the financial aspect, but we can also look into the behavioral risk. What are the topics, what are the markers of harm before people start spending a lot of money? Can we look into automation? If we continue detecting a lot of people, if we continue seeing a lot of markers of harm, we will need to recruit even more and more people. But can we use AI? Can we use automation for that? Can we be more efficient? And this is what our research was looking into. Now, if you go on the next slide, we see that one of the major issues in a lot of research and a lot of procedures is that self-exclusion was used as a proxy measure for problem gambling. Not to reject self-exclusion, because self-exclusion is still a very important tool. But if you work in the gambling industry, you know that this is not always the most reliant indicator. You see a lot of customers either using it to close their account, or we all know that we have those cases that are very difficult to handle, and we would have closed the account as operator, so we wouldn't have even gone through the self-exclusion route. And if you go on the next slide, we analyzed this type of information. So how reliable is voluntary self-exclusion in gambling to be a proxy measure for problem gambling? And this was a paper I did with Professor Griffiths, where we looked into all the customers that had self-excluded and see how much time was there before when they registered to self-exclusion. And you see that almost 20% of people self-exclude on the same day as registration. It could be that these people are coming because they gambled somewhere else and they did experience harm there, so they just registered to close their account. Or it could be that they, for example, signed up for a bonus, a sign-up bonus, and they didn't like it, so they chose to self-exclude because they know they won't be bothered again. And as well, what we did in the study was we compared these group of customers, two customers had actually said, I have a gambling problem. And when we compared gambling expenditure, for example, we saw that they were statistically different from each other. So that also raises questions. Is self-exclusion a good proxy measure, or should it be split? Perhaps even as a group, it's too heterogeneous compared to be able to measure it in that way. Next slide. So then later on in the year, I wanted to really have a look, okay, so what can we do? How can we identify good markers of harm? How can we think outside of the box? What can we get from information that maybe it's very unique to the operators or unique to lived experience? And I imagine most of you have heard of this, but there's the DSM-5, which is the handbook used by healthcare professionals, and it contains descriptions and criteria to diagnose mental disorders. And there is the gambling disorder, obviously. And if you go on the next slide, there are these 9 criteria. And if you have 4 or more in the last 12 months, you would be diagnosed with a gambling disorder. But obviously, if you're an operator, you can't really see it. It's not really that clear. So what the exercise did was mainly to ask other stakeholders, so asking people with lived experience, treatment centers, regulators, identifying how they would see preoccupation as a marker of harm, how they would see tolerance as a marker of harm. And just to give you an idea, for example, preoccupation, me and Mark used the fact that people would stay longer online compared to others. Escapism might use games that actually promote this a bit more. Loss of control, people who set up a deposit limit but then remove it or increase it significantly. Risking significant relationships, when most operators have this issue where they would have a third party calling for a person and they can't do anything because of data protection. But you know there must be some issue with that relationship if the wife is calling you about her husband's activity. And then, in order to get away from the self-exclusion as a proxy measure for problem gambling, what we did was we got a full sample of UK customers from Kindred and identified each of the translated marker of harm into this data. So for each customer, how many times did they change their limit, or how many hours did they spend online? If you go on the next slide, this is my colleague trying to make my madness seem even more explainable, to be fair, very simple. But mainly what we did was we standardized the data so we can compare, for example, if you have amount of money with time, so it can be comparable. And then we did cluster analysis in order to group customers in the best way statistically. So if we use all these markers of harm, how would they group as different, through these clusters? And if you go on the next slide, this is what we saw. So 4 groups of customers came out. The most of the customers actually came into what we call the non-problem gambler cluster, where the majority of the population actually scored negatively on these markers of harm. And then if you look into the figure 2, you see that this is more what we call the financially vulnerable, because they showed more intense behavior on things that are more financially dependent. So you see chasing and daily deposit. If you go on the next slide, you see the last 2 remaining groups, where one of them we call the emotionally vulnerable, and you see here you have a higher increase in abusive communication and bonus begging. This is always quite a difficult topic as well for people who work in customer service, where you have customers that are becoming very abusive because of the psychological strain that they're going through. But obviously, this will shift onto your staff as well. and people who constantly beg for bonus. Give me more money to gamble. I deserve this. And then we also see the last cluster, which was almost around 30%, where the population did show signs, did show the markers of harm, but not as intensely as the previously mentioned two groups. Next slide. And I always encourage, especially operators, is to publish this. So if you're interested in having a look at this or checking what we did in the study, it's also published in the Journal of Gambling Studies because it's useless to keep a discussion just to the company. So it's very good to do it like that. And then the trick is how to bridge that information, that data into operational reality. And what we see is that, just to give you an example, when I went to our data analyst and I said, listen, I did this study, how can we do it operationally? Bonus begging, when I did the study, I was looking into previous live chats and communication. But obviously, we need to act fast there. So, what the data analyst in this case did was he translated those markers of harm into even better operational markers of harm. So, he used data from web analytics where he can see if a customer is just going to check on the bonus page, if there is someone constantly checking if there's a bonus available, using different risk algorithms in order to detect chasing rather than what I used for the research paper. And depending on the score, I also am a firm believer that depending on the risk, there should be a dependence on the intervention. So we see that if you're at the highest risk, what we call RG risk level 1, it's very low volume, exceptional cases, so even the interventions are more invasive. So in our case, we would stop the possibility to deposit until we communicate with the customer. Level 2 is very humanistic, where there is an RG analyst looking into your account and seeing how can we, help this customer. And we have to realize as well there are certain differences. Like if we go and try to get someone who's 18 years old or 21 years old, they might not answer the phone. So it's better to have a pop-up message. Whereas if you have someone who's maybe a bit older, they might actually appreciate a phone call. And level 3 is something that we're working on, where we're looking into having more automated messaging. So messaging that comes up and actually disrupts the gameplay to be able to help people get back on track. Next slide. But obviously, there's always limitations to every research. First of all, the major limitation is that the data was only from one operator. So it was only from Unibet. So the view is quite limited. We know that gamblers play across different operators. Some of the markers of harm were still very novel. So they weren't used in other research. So they need to be researched even more. And some of them may have been a bit narrow. So for example, chasing that was mentioned in this paper, Michael Auer and Mark Griffiths actually published a paper later on, which takes into a better approach on how to detect chasing. And I think something to keep in mind is what is the next step in this research studies? And a longitudinal approach is very good. So to be able to compare what was done this year compared to maybe in 2 years' time. Combined with self-report data, again, Michael and Mark actually did publish something similar a few months ago, where they combined data from customers from PGSI, from the tests that they did, and also to how the customer gambled online, and single customer view, which is quite a hot topic, where at least for research, it would be really good to be able to see a holistic account history for a customer. And that is all I have for you today. As I mentioned, if you have any questions, you can ask them. But in the meantime, I think we can reintroduce the panel so I can shut up a bit at least. So to start off with, and this is the favorite part for me because I get to ask questions and I can just see you suffer instead of me answering them. So As mentioned, there is a lot of discussion on markers of harm and consumer protection. But in all fairness, there is always a limit on how much interventions can actually change the person's behavior. And I think having such a diverse panel is really good because we have Mindway AI, which is a software company that detects these markers of harm. We have Grania from another operator, Dan Spencer, lived experience, but also Dan Whitlam from GamCare. So maybe I can start with Dan Spencer. So what do you think? So markers of harm, very good, but can we really, how much can we see that interventions will actually change the behavior?
Yeah, I think thanks, Marius. The question, is it limited? I think it's only limited really by the quality of the interaction that we have. I think there's two main points to get right here. The first being identification, and companies can use people like Mindway to do that and get really rich data. But I think the key questions to answer at this stage is, did we identify the markers quickly enough? Are they the right markers to be looking at? Is now the right time to interact? I think is a really interesting question. What do we want to then go and achieve by that interaction? And lastly, how are you going to measure that? And then you've got the interaction itself. So who's the right team to do it? Is there a person in your team to do that interaction? What's the method? Is it an email, text chat, phone call? What's the severity of that detection? As we know, especially in the UK market, we're now being asked to match the severity of the markers to the type of interaction that we have. The goal in terms of that interaction needs to fall into a couple of categories. Are we educating and preventing harm? Yeah. Are we educating the customer, or is this really an intervention? And through the work that I've done and what I've seen and heard, I've probably experienced the full spectrum of reactions that we get from those interventions or interactions. And all of the time that we're seeing really brilliant conversations that result in honest reflection by the customer, then in my view, it's worth doing and we should continue to do it. Yes, you'll get those customers that don't appreciate the intervention, and to some respects that also means it's worth doing, because you probably hit on somebody that does need to honestly reflect about their gambling. But I think when you look at, can interventions change player behavior, it can. And not only that, it can keep a player in a safe place for the rest of their life if done well. It can save financial and emotional heartache. It can help you retain your license. It can help a business thrive based on a sustainable player base. And ultimately, like you say about sharing data, you can help change a whole industry and lift that up and upskill the rest of them. So it's so valuable. I think interactions is what drives me doing the job that I do. I'm passionate about it. Because at Epic, we've got 19 lived experience employees now that never had a single interaction with any gambling company they used. And some of our people at Epic had, I had 75 online accounts. I think Paul had 90 or something like that. So it's a passion for us. And, if you want to prevent harm, we must arm every punter to be able to protect themselves. Addiction will happen, harm will happen, but everybody deserves a chance for it not to be them. And for me, the silver bullet to that is interactions. And that doesn't mean we tick the box and say we've interacted, now it's on the player. But that quality of that interaction is so important. So yeah, I think those 2 points of, have we got the timing of the interaction right, and do we have the quality, the training to back that up, and the right people to do it?
Yeah, and I think I can then direct this to the other Dan as well, because GamCare do a lot of this work, even with us in Kindred, on how we can do good interaction and that type of training as well. Do you want to chip in?
Yeah, thanks, Marius. Just to echo a couple of Dan's points, clearly timing of interaction is going to be critical. Catching that risk as early as possible in the customer journey, and also before there is a risk, actually communicating the potential risks and kind of normalizing some of the kind of safer gambling tools as well, so that you can protect customers earlier in the journey. In terms of the quality, I think if we flip it, clearly a bad interaction, as Dan said, is going to have negative consequences. So yeah, I think Dan's right, to be honest. The timing and the quality. Just to add on that kind of proactive point, so just nudging the customer early on in the journey.
Yeah, and with timing and nudging, I think this is a good segue then for Rasmus, if you want to add something on this. You're on mute, I think.
Sorry for that. Yes, thank you, Maris. Especially what Ben and Dan emphasize here is of course the need for also a better, let's say, foundation of doing those interventions, because when you are a small gambling operator, you have a number of thousand customers. The big ones have way more than 1 million daily. So obviously, to deal with this in RG operations, except from the most severe cases, you need to automatize this. So it needs to be automated, and to be able to automate it, and maybe even doing it earlier and on an individual customer level, individual gambling behavior. The sophistication of the detection system providing the background and the foundation to be able to do this automated intervention large scale needs also to be enhanced from sometimes we see kind of manual detection done in Excel spreadsheets. And I think hopefully those days are over, even though we still meet it. We also sometimes meet actually literally no detection, even though of course that depends on jurisdiction and regulation and so on. So what we want to achieve with what we do is actually providing this foundation of a sophisticated detection using AI in combination with human experts, deploying what you could call a virtual psychologist based on an individual player's individual gambling behavior, including the markers of harm and we call it the risk factors, but literally it's the same. And giving a much more granulated individual point of view on the gambling behavior, paving the road for interaction in the way relevant for the specific customer in context of the specific customer's individual player behavior.
Yeah, of course, operators will vary because we have here Kindred and Entain. So you have big operators definitely. with more resources, but if you have a startup, I think the fact that they have Excel sheets is still quite a good start.
It's better than nothing, definitely, yes. Exactly, but I think that I'm also calling a little bit for enhancement on that at least as well, yes. But I totally agree. Some manual-based detection is better than no detection, because each person we can help is the way forward for us at least.
So more from a practical perspective, Gronya, maybe if you have any input on this.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Maris, for a really good presentation, which touches on a lot of the themes that we work with internally at Entain in terms of the importance of automation and looking for behavioural triggers, which I'll come on to in a minute. But we're also lucky at Entain because we work with everybody on the panel. So a big plug for everybody here. I think on interventions, as everybody's already said, it's a very complex area and there is no one single silver bullet. So what we've tried to do at Entain through our Advanced Responsibility and Care Programme, or ARC programme, as we like to call it for short, is basically take the best of everybody's abilities and merge them together. Excuse me. So that we have an automated AI model in ARC which looks for behavioural triggers in our customers who might be at risk. We work with Rasmus and the team at Mindway on that model to make sure that we're looking for the right things. We also actually do that in real time. So it's automated but in the moment. So we're not waiting for a day or 2 days afterwards, at which point, as we know from Epic and Dan and the team, the intervention is probably too late. So using our technology and our AI, we look for the triggers. We then work with Epic to understand how best to intervene with our customers. We do that on both an automated basis and also a human basis. So it can be emails, pop-ups, phone calls. And what we've seen is actually some really good results in that 90% of our customers are not going on to risky play after our interventions, which hopefully is testament to all the great work and the partnerships that we're doing across the board to make sure that we spot signs of problems early, interact with them in the right way and at the right time to make sure that customers aren't going on to play in a risky manner with us. But there's obviously always more we can do.
Dream come true for anyone working in RG. Even I wouldn't say so many good things. I would still say, like, we need to do this in Kindred. And obviously, I mean, it is a dream come true, you know, to have so many possibilities. The fact that you can do everything real time, it's not always that easy. And just to try and also push forward, you know, if an operator cannot do this, at least something is done. And most of the time, all the panelists here are very open for discussions. If not, I just made them to be. But to go on then, so you have, as I mentioned, Kindred and Entain, big companies, they've been doing RG for quite a bit. And then you have other companies that maybe are just starting, or they just have a new RG manager, because we still see some companies that don't have RG managers. Question for Dan Gamke, not Epic. Do you think that, you know, like it was mentioned even in the webinar yesterday, having some common definitions for harmful gambling or common definitions for markers of harm would actually help, especially when it comes to informing safer gambling policies?
Well, yeah, it would definitely help. Even at a high level, I think there's lots of kind of inconsistencies around the language used. You know, even kind of responsible gambling versus safer gambling, problem gambling versus gambling related harm that we now use more of in the UK. Even some language inconsistency around affected others. So yeah, I think in the UK we've shifted more to an individual focused language. So actually shifting that problem to harm and from responsible to kind of safer to share the, I guess, the responsibility, not just on the individual but on the operator as well. So yeah, getting that language and definitions kind of more consistent across Europe would definitely help that. In terms of kind of the markers of harm, which I know was mentioned yesterday, yeah, even within the UK, there's not particularly consistent use of markers of harm. I think the BGC, or the kind of trade association here, originally had 30 or so markers that were used by kind of their big operators. The Gambling Commission have now kind of introduced some kind of mandatory requirements around 7 markers around things like spend, you know, behavioural, contact, safe gambling tools, account-based indicators, and then time, which is quite a new focus in the UK. So yeah, just consistencies within the same country are a struggle, but clearly across Europe are going to be a challenge. And I think if we get those kind of definitions more consistent and have really well-defined markers, particularly, yeah, it's clearly going to help us better identify those risks and harms. And, you know, if we've got that right, that's going to allow us to build kind of more consistent data models, better AI, and just ultimately identify customers more quickly and you know, provide that support that they need.
Yeah, I think in an ideal world, if we had regulators actually working together, it would make it so much easier for RG managers. Because I hear a lot, like, from some companies that they would have one approach for Sweden and UK and another approach for .com, because depending on how strict the regulator is, I'm just telling, like, we should have stricter regulators. I don't know why I do this to myself. From Rasmus, there's always these discussions, AI, automation, but also we have really good knowledge coming from humanistic interventions.
Mm.
Do you think that AI is more accurate than humans then to identify markers of harm? And do you think that technology will actually make it even more personalized than a human could?
Well, a question against your question would be: Are humans perfect? So I'm not saying that. I definitely don't think that we can say that AI is more accurate, more perfect than humans. On the other hand, humans are not perfect either. That's the reason for my question. But what we try to combine is you could call it best of both worlds, because we combine AI with human experts, RG psychologists. So literally what we deploy, and for the record, with all sizes of operators, not only the big ones, but also the medium and small ones as well, a kind of virtual psychologist approach. And what we have strived for is to, of course, make it as accurate as possible, because obviously it's not possible to do a human assessment on each and every customer account in even a small operator's database, let's say 5-10,000 customers active daily. That's not doable to have human psychologists to assess. So what we try to achieve with this virtual psychologist approach is to replicate the psychologists, and we have quite a high accuracy on that one, because we, as the first RegTech software provider, to our understanding, anywhere in the world, have asked a testing company to test and validate our software. In our case, we asked GLI to test and validate the software, and they found that in at least 87% of the cases, our AI virtual psychologist has the same accuracy as a human psychologist, bearing in mind that what we aim for when we build AI solutions is around 90%. That is a common aim for AI in general. So I would say we have come to a certain level or significant level in accuracy already, but our main focus is to empower operators with this, for them to enhance their player protection. And obviously, our daily aim and goal is to try our utmost to maintain and increase this accuracy. If I may comment on what you just said, Maris, as a final part of this question, I really agree that it is a challenge that we don't have kind of standardizing in detection. In many jurisdictions, there's not even set out in the regulation that you have to have detection in place. And in kind of every jurisdiction, we know what we have to detect and monitor and ultimately give as foundation for the interaction is different between the regulation. On top of that, there's no such thing as certification or standards in terms of developing these solutions. So it kind of comes down to best practices with each supplier. Obviously, now I do kind of the same you do, Maris. So I would ask for higher standards on this, maybe even certification. We will be ready to join that any day, because definitely I think that would be increased standard as a foundation for better player protection in general.
Although I'm a bit afraid, because I think you might replace me with AI in the future, so
Not at all.
I'll be very wary how to.
We do AI with the human touch, you know.
Okay, yeah, that's how I will be replaced eventually. We have a question from the audience, and I think it's more directed to me and Grania, because it's more around operators. So the question is, I'm curious what role does self-exclusion play in the intervention process at participating operators? At what stage is the closure of the account offered, and for how long? And if so, how do players react to this? I can start a bit, and then Krania, if you want to chip in. I think from a Kindred perspective, it's usually depending on the risk. If we see that the person really cannot control himself, we would suggest self-exclusion. By suggest, I mean push a bit. And usually it's more as a stepped care approach. So we might start off with the 7-day and then push them to go for the 6 months. And reaction-wise, it's always been quite good. I only had a few that really shouted at me so far. Grania, anything
Yeah,
from
thanks, Maris. Ours is very similar. So it all depends really on the customer and the type of issue and the risk level. We would only force a self-exclusion in the most serious of cases. And again, there are options, whether that's a week, 6 months, a year, 5 years. Again, it depends on the case in question. Responses, I would say, are mixed. Again, every individual is different. Each of their causes and consequences are different. So it depends on that as to how they react. But I would say the majority of the time people accept eventually, if not at the time, that it's for their own good.
We're getting quite a few questions. Another one is for you, Rasmus, actually. Does this virtual psychologist approach means survey data in short? That is, in order to predict a problem gambler, you need some kind of survey response to act as a target variable on which to train a model. Because yesterday it was mentioned in the webinar that there's a gap between survey data and objective metrics.
Yeah, it does not mean that it kind of involves a survey. So the way we do it is we ask our team of responsible gambling psychologists to assess a sample of the customer database when we deploy a new algorithm or train a new algorithm. So we use the experts' assessments as the clear target of the algorithm. I hope that answers the question.
Cool. I heard I will not be replaced soon, so I like that answer.
Yeah.
I see that the Dans are quiet, so I need to pick on them. Let's start with Spencer. One of the major issues that we see is trust. Obviously, operators are not trusted. We wouldn't blame them when we see a lot of stuff that we do. So how do you think operators should address the issue of customer trust, especially when it comes to decisions and actions being done by the safer gambling systems and the interactions that are done with the customer?
Well, I think that comparative play is a term that I use to describe the powerful notion of letting a player know that they're an outlier in a situation, and that's often the only data you hold in that conversation that the player is unaware of. So if you're using Mindway as your software solution, for example, you will know how that player sits amongst your entire player base, but that player won't know themselves. If I think back to the harmful gambling that I was involved with in my addiction, and a lot of people that I will talk to in recovery, one thing that is in common with those people is that they all believed at the time that their behavior was normal. They normalized that behavior in amongst not just their own play, but the people they surround themselves with. When I started working in this role, and I started to understand a little bit more about what is actually normal in this world of gambling, one of the first things that shocked me was we were working with a client around FOBTs in UK bookmakers, and I was asked what I thought the average session on one of those machines was in terms of time. And I knew that I gambled more than most. I was an addicted gambler. I would spend 5 or 6 hours on one of those machines, but I kind of reasoned that an average player would spend maybe 2 to 3 hours. The actual answer is something like 4 minutes, So that's really powerful information that I could have been provided in that moment, to then come to the realization that I was a complete outlier in that situation. I'm lucky enough to be asked to conduct SG interactions with customers on behalf of operators now and again. Often they will be very wealthy customers that are not showing signs of harm necessarily, but by the nature of their gambling, because they are wealthy customers, it's high risk. And it's really a proactive interaction to enable that player to understand the risks and what to do, and how to notice this in themselves, and if they ever did need help, where to go. And I've used Mindway scores, for example, in that conversation to say to a player, look, you understand that we can't be having phone calls with every single player. We use this system called Mindway, and here's what it does. And then I'll say, look, you're scored 95 out of 100, for example, and that enables that player to put that picture together and understand that, hang on, if my bookmaker is calling me, if my casino is calling me to have a conversation about this, and I'm considered a high risk customer, even though the harm might not be happening now, because systems like Mindway and other proactive systems are looking at behavior that might lead to harm. They're not looking at signs of harm right now. But if that player understands that they're on that journey, or could be on that journey in the future, then they might make more intelligent decisions when they are in control, before they cross that line of acting in ways that are not in their control. So I guess to come back to your question about gaining trust with a customer during an interaction, if you want honest answers from them, you need to be upfront and honest with them. And I wouldn't be afraid of doing that, and tell them about how your systems work and why you're making the call, and you know, be honest. And if you want that honesty reciprocated, that would be my advice.
Touching. The other Dan, the thing is, and I see this a lot, operators say that they do a lot of things, but they don't. So it's sometimes a PR stunt. I love how how I say these things. Do you think there's any way to enhance or certify trustworthiness in safer gambling systems or in procedures?
Yeah, thanks, Maris. Yeah, so GamCare, we've got a certification product. There are obviously others out there, but in the UK, we look to kind of independently assess safer gambling practices and initiatives across operators. So we kind of go into business, we look across all areas that touch on safer gambling. So how they manage customers, the environment they create for those customers, how they train, educate colleagues, how they support colleagues in their own potential risks around gambling. We do a kind of big piece around culture and how they create a safer gambling culture, and then things like governance and comms around that. And yeah, we're not just looking at operators kind of ticking the boxes in terms of you know, the regulatory requirements. We look at best practice and almost benchmarking those operators that are kind of going way above and beyond what they, you know, the requirements you know, are setting out, and that really allows us to kind of raise standards across the industry. You know, the outputs of our work and reports that we provide to the operators, kind of give them those recommendations to basically raise those standards to nearer to that best practice. And going forward, we're looking at how we can then share that best practice across the industry. And whilst that kind of certification product is UK focused at the moment, we are looking at kind of international options with that as well.
Cool. We have a lot of questions coming in, which is really good, but I'm sure we won't answer all of them. There is one which is slightly controversial. I like it. The question is, are we asking private companies to address a public health problem? How do we feel about this, and any conflicts of interest that could crop up? Anyone wants to try?
Yeah,
I'll start. Oh,
okay,
go on.
so Raz.
Ladies first.
Yeah, of course.
So I think it's a really good question, and to a certain extent, the answer is yes, we are asking private companies to look at a public health issue, but should we? I mean, there's a debate around whether problem gambling is a public health issue, which is probably a topic for a whole other session. But just coming back to the question of whether we as operators should be doing it, I think absolutely yes. Because whether it's a public health issue or not, we know that the vast majority of our customers play with us sensibly and responsibly and enjoy it as part of their entertainment. But there is unfortunately a small minority who don't. And I think only a responsible operator who is being proactive in this space and trying to look after their customers will be a sustainable one, because customers are terrible for business. So I think, you know, public company, private company, partners, all of us are in this together. And we should all be striving every day, as I know we are, to reduce the number of those who have problem gambling.
Rasmus, you want to chip in?
Yes, definitely. I totally agree, Granny. I think that was kind of seen from a little bit outside, more or less the same. I would emphasize, though, as a CEO of a company, I think it's important for me any day to try to protect and inform my customers in the best way possible on what can kind of hit them. And I guess that should go for any kind of company, also gambling operators. Obviously, to some extent, because on the other hand, there is a limit with the on what you can impose on private commercial companies in terms of the very few percentages, the severe cases we see that actually have problems, and they should get definitely the proper help. And in the meantime, if you try your utmost to detect, monitor, and do the sophisticated interaction we have talked about today, of course, there's an opportunity that we ease the pressure on the most severe cases first, and second, also if it's done automated in the operators' systems, then of course there's also a full track record of what had been done. Should anybody ask the operator, what have you done with this case, for instance? So I think it's a double thing to some extent, yes, but the very few percentage is a public health issue, of course, unfortunately.
Keeping in mind, and I'm being devil's advocate here, conflict of interest. We need to keep in mind that, you know, we're saying it's a very small percentage of active players, but sometimes that small percentage of active players might contribute to more revenue. So
oh yeah, and the other thing
that
is that
is a huge conflict of. I remember when I started in RG, I think all the VIP managers wanted to kill me because I was, you know, asking like, why is this person depositing so much? So there is a huge conflict of interest, especially if the company is still small or still getting used to RG.
Yeah, but I also meet small operators actually, where sometimes that is definitely game changing in their business, actually taking the position that they have to do it to close off such accounts. I also think that there is another issue in terms of even a small percentage can be a very large number of people given the size of the customer database. So there's definitely challenges, but
yeah. Do you, any of the Dans want to chip in?
Yeah, I think the conflict's important, actually. I often talk to operators about there being an internal tug of war between commercial teams and RG teams, and I think that tug of war is really important. That tension on the rope should be there at all times, and there should never ever be a winner to that conflict. And I think that some of our programs operators aren't ready for yet, and we have to slow down the rollout of what we do. Most notably in the US, some of the biggest companies we're working with right now aren't ready for our interactions training. So we're spending the first year raising awareness. And I think when we get to the end of that year and we start talking about how to interact with customers, it's a good moment to check that those teams are both pulling on that rope. So I don't think the conflict is too bad. You know, I think that responsible gambling teams should be challenging commercial teams, and commercial teams should be challenging back. The public health issue is one part of the puzzle, but as Grania said, you know, it makes commercial sense, you know, what we're doing. it's media reputation, regulation and compliance. There's so many pieces and reasons why we would be doing what we're doing in responsible gambling. If Kindred and Entain can see that, then every other operator should take their lead on it, because they're some of the most commercially successful. So yeah, I think conflict's important. It is a public health issue, but everyone has to play their part.
Cool. We have quite a few questions. We have, but we don't have the time. So like we have some on the Italian market, because it's still starting in RG. A very interesting one where, you know, if we have so many operators doing more doc than doc, why aren't we doing more outright advocating for more requirements? I don't know how to answer that, to be fair, because you always will receive some resistance. And also, there's a question here about if we had to share detail of customer data and RG risk setting, like Mindway, directly to the customers, how that would interact. The thing is, we only have 3 minutes left, and EGBA are very, very strict. So what we'll do is we'll get the questions, and we'll really try our best to get the panelists to answer them and send them to you via email. To finish the webinar, I have one question, and keep it short, guys. Okay. So we start off with Gronia, and then the others can follow. So if you could pick one thing, now either at the regulatory level or an industry level, which you think would really help promote safer gambling at a customer level, what would it be?
Yeah, good question, and it's probably a relatively cheesy answer, but working in partnership with the likes of the people on this panel would be my key tip. So I think it's important that operators accept that we can't do it all ourselves. Yes, we have loads of good knowledge and data and technology and experts, but actually at the end of the day, we need help from everybody else. And Rasmus, Dan and Dan are great partners. So if anybody is not working with them, then I would highly suggest you do so.
Answer?
You're on mute, Dan.
Firstly, appreciate the endorsement, Gronia. Thank you for that. I think if I look at regulatory, my one wish would be to push the smaller operators to be having as many vocal interactions with their customers as some of the large ones are. I still come across too many smaller operators that consider an email the only interaction they need to have with customers. And I think we need to go back to more phone calls, even text chats. It needs to be two-way conversation. So that would be mine.
Rasmus?
Thanks, Granny. I would say what I emphasized before, higher standards or similar standards on detection and monitoring solution, because that's the foundation of what we have talked about in this panel for enhanced interactions and player protection.
And Dan?
I think for me, probably a focus on the customer as an individual rather than kind of a more generic approach to safer gambling and risk models. And that sounds as though, thinking about the affordability and vulnerability of customers individually, as opposed to, more generic tools.
Cool. Questions kept coming in, so we have quite a few more in UK and how players don't like to interact and stuff like that, but we'll really try to follow through with the EGBA. And someone asked about the recording. It will be available later. It's 12 on the dot. I would just like to thank all the panelists and everyone who attended this webinar. I'm sorry you had to hear my voice for so long, but thanks so much, Rasmus, Gronia, Dan, and Dan, for joining.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Maris.
Thank you.
Maris.